Hey there. We're diving deep into The Lean Startup today by Ries. You've given us excerpts from the book itself,
Excellent.
which is perfect because you're looking to actually put these lessons into action.
Yeah.
So think of this deep dive as your cheat sheet for building a business when, things are uncertain, no ramen noodle diet required.
Exactly. And it's fascinating. I think one of the things that's fascinating about this book is how Ries bridges ideas from seemingly different worlds, like car manufacturing and software development.
Right.
He shows how lean thinking can be this powerful tool in any field, not just tech.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea. The Lean Startup, at its core, is all about this concept of validated learning.
Right.
Ries is really hammering home this point that startups aren't just about building things, they're about learning what customers want
Mm-hmm.
and then building a sustainable business around that.
Yeah, it's applying this scientific mindset to entrepreneurship.
Right.
Rees makes this great analogy to driving a car. You wouldn't just blindly follow a set route with your eyes closed, would you? You constantly adjust
Right.
based on what you see on the road. The lean startup is about applying that same thinking, that same build, measure, learn feedback loop to your business using real world data from customers.
So you're constantly adapting and evolving based on what you learn.
Exactly.
Ries doesn't just talk theory, though. He brings up a lot of real-world examples, including his own experience with IMVU. Um, what's the big takeaway from that story for you?
Well, I think the IMBU story is a powerful example of a minimum viable product,
Okay.
or MVP, in action. What's really surprising is they actually launched with a product that they knew was flawed intentionally.
Wow.
The goal wasn't to impress anyone, it was to just quickly test their riskiest assumptions.
Hold on. So they were okay with putting out like a bad product.
Not bad, but definitely bare bones. They
Wow.
needed answers to critical questions about their market, right? Would people even want avatar-based instant messaging? Would they use it to connect with existing friends or make new ones?
Right.
Launching a minimal version allowed them to get those answers way faster and cheaper
Yeah.
than spending years perfecting something that ultimately nobody might want.
So they got real user feedback quickly, and that allowed them to adapt. And Ries backs this up with more examples of companies like Zappos and Intuit that use the same principles successfully.
Exactly. The Zappos story is a classic example of using an MVP to test market demand.
Okay.
They started by just simply offering shoes online to see if people actually wanted a better online shoe buying experience. They could have done market research, they could have asked people in surveys,
Right.
but nothing beats actually seeing how customers behave.
So you've built your MVP, you're measuring the results, now it's time to learn. But traditional accounting doesn't quite cut it for startups, does it?
You're right, and that's where this idea of innovation accounting comes in.
Okay.
Ries is a huge advocate for using what he calls actionable metrics.
Metrics that directly measure customer behavior. Forget vanity metrics like website hits. He's all about things like customer retention
Right.
and engagement.
Okay, can you give me an example of how that might play out in a real startup?
Absolutely. Grocket, the online test prep company,
Right.
is a perfect example of how focusing on the wrong metrics can be misleading.
Uh-huh.
Initially, they were seeing growth in things like total users and questions answered,
Right.
but those metrics didn't actually reflect what mattered most, which was student learning and retention.
So they were celebrating numbers that looked good on the surface, but didn't tell the whole story.
Exactly. And they realized
Mhm.
they needed to pivot, but not in the typical way that we think about pivoting.
Well, fine.
Instead of changing the product, they changed how they measured it.
Okay.
By focusing on these actionable metrics tied to actual student outcomes, they could finally see what was truly effective and what wasn't.
That's so important because I think it's easy to get caught up in those
Yeah.
surface level numbers that
Don't
absolutely
tell the whole story.
Precisely. And Ries provides a lot of practical tools to help with this.
Okay.
One of them is the 5 whys analysis. It sounds really simple,
Okay.
but it's incredibly powerful.
Mm-hmm.
It's this way of getting to the root cause of a problem.
Okay.
It's about asking why repeatedly, to dig beneath the surface and figure out what are those underlying factors that are contributing to a problem.
So it's not about pointing fingers, it's about understanding the bigger picture.
You got it, and you can use it for anything.
Okay.
From technical glitches to, lagging business results.
Right.
Once you understand that root cause, you can make these really targeted, proportional investments in solutions, whether that's improving training, refining your processes, or even pivoting your whole strategy.
Wow, this is resonating with me already because I've definitely
Yeah.
been guilty of chasing the wrong metrics in the past.
Hmm.
Ries also talks about the importance of testing assumptions even for seasoned companies. Like HP uses this example of HP's initiative to get more employees volunteering.
Yeah, and they had a person, Caroline Barlerin, who was leading this initiative, and she had a plan based on
Right.
HP's long-standing values, their history of community involvement. But Rees pushes her to treat even those assumptions
Hmm.
as testable hypotheses.
So instead of just assuming that employees would jump at the chance to volunteer because HP had this past history,
Hmm.
they needed to actually test that in the real world.
Exactly. Rees suggests starting with a small group of employees and offering them a really exceptional volunteering opportunity and just observe what they do,
Hmm.
not what they say they would do.
So it's like a mini experiment to validate the assumptions behind the whole initiative.
Exactly. And by starting with those early adopters, those employees that are already most likely to be enthusiastic about volunteering, she can gather valuable insights to refine the program
Good.
before rolling it out company-wide.
Now, Rees also uses the example of Kodak's struggle to adapt to the digital age.
Right.
It's fascinating how they tried to apply a lean approach to develop new products for their online platform Kodak Gallery.
And it's interesting, they had this idea called picture mail, which was all about
Okay.
creating these beautiful physical greeting cards from online photos.
Mm-hmm.
And they just assumed that people would love these tangible products, but they kind of put the cart before the horse. They invested heavily in production
Oh.
before validating that core demand.
So they learned a hard lesson about testing the market
Right.
before diving headfirst into production.
Exactly. Then they took a totally different approach
Right.
with their event album feature. Instead of going all in on development,
Hmm.
they did beta launches and used tools like online surveys to gather feedback and really iterate quickly.
So it's a good reminder that even established companies
Mm-hmm.
need to be agile and adapt in today's world.
Absolutely.
And Ries
Hmm.
even applies these principles to something as massive as a government agency, suggesting that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau treat their launch like an experiment.
Right. He says instead of, launching a nationwide hotline right away, start small.
Yeah.
Pilot it in a limited area.
Okay.
And even use targeted online ads to get the word out.
So even a government agency with a big budget
Mm-hmm.
can benefit from starting small
Yeah.
and testing their assumptions.
Absolutely. It's about having that MVP, that minimum viable product,
Right.
even if it's just a scaled down version of the full vision,
Right.
and then letting the data guide your decisions.
Okay, so now Ries brings us back to validated learning, using his experience with IMVU
Mm-hmm.
as a key example.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me more about how validated learning works and how IMVU actually applied it?
So in the early days of IMVU,
Okay.
Rees and his team had this big vision. They wanted to revolutionize instant messaging.
Hmm.
They were going to build this standalone platform with 3D avatars. They thought they could disrupt the existing IM world. And they even came up with this sophisticated strategy for leveraging these network effects
Wow.
to get a huge user base.
So they had a plan, but what happened when they launched?
Crickets.
Yeah.
It turned out their assumptions about the market way off account. Customers weren't interested in the avatar-based IM add-on
Oh.
that they'd built.
So their brilliant plan backfired.
Yeah, at first it was definitely a blow, but it was also a moment of profound validated learning
Okay.
because through customer interviews and observation,
Mhm.
they realized that their assumptions about what customers wanted were just fundamentally wrong.
So they learned a tough lesson, but what did they do with that knowledge?
They used it to pivot. They scrapped the IM add-on idea and focused on creating a standalone IM network.
Okay.
And they also discovered something really interesting. People were more interested in using avatars to make new friends online, not just connect with existing ones.
So they actually listened to the feedbacks
Exactly.
and adapted their product to what the market wanted.
Exactly. It's a classic pivot story. And it really highlights this core principle of the lean startup, which is using validated learning
Mm-hmm.
to make informed decisions about whether to stick with your original plan or change direction.
So turning a setback into a learning opportunity.
Absolutely.
Ries also emphasizes that validated learning isn't just about collecting data.
Mm-hmm.
It's about actually using that data to inform your decisions.
Right.
And he uses Zappos again to illustrate this point.
Yeah, Zappos is a great example of building a successful business
Okay.
using validated learning. They started with this really simple question: is there actually enough demand for a better way to buy shoes online?
Mm.
So instead of doing traditional market research, they created this minimum viable product, just a really basic website
Right.
offering shoes online.
So they tested the hypothesis with a really simple product.
Exactly. And that MVP did way more than just answer that initial question. It allowed them to interact directly with customers, giving them invaluable qualitative data through these conversations and feedback and observation.
So it was much more hands-on,
Oh,
giving
yeah.
them these insights that you wouldn't get from a survey or something.
Right. They learned about customer preferences, their frustrations. They even discovered new opportunities.
Well,
That direct engagement is a core part of validated learning.
and that obviously paid off for Zappos because they ended up being
Yeah.
acquired by Amazon.
It's a testament to how powerful this approach can be.
So Ries didn't just focus on private companies, though he also applies these principles to a variety of situations.
Yeah.
Let's dive into some of those examples.
One interesting case study is Carolyn Barlerin's effort at HP to increase employee volunteering.
Hmm.
Ries encourages her to treat the initiative almost like a startup.
Okay.
Identify your key assumptions
Right, yeah.
and then test those assumptions with experiments.
So even a giant company like HP
Absolutely.
can benefit from a lean startup mindset.
Oh, absolutely. Ries suggests starting small with a group of employees
Okay.
who already strongly identify with HP's values.
And this is their core assumption.
Exactly.
Are employees actually motivated to volunteer?
Hmm.
Because HP has this legacy of community service.
Right. And by watching how these employees actually behave,
Right.
she can gather data
Mm-hmm.
that she can use to improve the program before rolling it out company-wide.
Makes sense.
Huh?
And Ries also offers concrete guidance on applying these principles to product development.
Mm-hmm.
He uses this example of Kodak trying to adapt to the digital age with their online platform, Kodak Gallery.
Right. And initially, they were trying to create this physical product called picture mail.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was that people would want these tangible greeting cards made from their online photos.
Okay.
But they realized pretty quickly they invested in production without actually validating that there was even demand for this.
Another good reminder to test the market before going all in.
Exactly. They learned their lesson and took a different approach
Right.
with their event album feature instead of jumping straight into development.
Right.
They did beta launches, and they used tools like online surveys to gather feedback and iterate much more quickly.
It's a great example of how an established company can still benefit from being agile and taking a customer-centric approach.
Absolutely. And Ries doesn't stop there. He even suggests applying lean startup principles to government agencies.
A government agency
Yeah.
acting like a startup. That's intriguing.
He uses the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as an example, and he says, think of your launch like an experiment.
Okay.
Start with an MVP.
Hmm.
In this case, it might be a limited pilot program for their hotline.
Gotcha.
Don't just launch a nationwide hotline right away.
So even with a huge budget, it makes sense to start small and test those core assumptions.
Exactly. This allows you to gather data and make data-driven decisions
Right.
to ensure that what you're doing is actually aligned with what customers need.
Okay. These examples really show how versatile the lean startup methodology is.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just for tech startups.
Right.
It really applies to
Any organization.
any organization that's dealing
That's facing uncertainty.
uncertainty.
Exactly.
And one of the most important concepts, I think, in the book that Ries introduces is the idea of the minimum viable product,
Yeah.
or MVP.
The MVP.
I've heard this term before, but how does it fit into this whole lean startup framework?
So an MVP isn't about building the perfect product right out of the gate. It's about creating the version that allows you to test your most crucial assumptions
Okay,
as quickly as possible.
gotcha.
So it's really about getting something into the hands of your customers and then learning from their feedback.
So real-world data trumps assumptions and projections every time.
Mhm.
Can you share some examples of some of the MVPs from the book?
Groupon is a really great example. Their very first MVP was incredibly simple. It was just a basic WordPress blog offering discounts on pizza.
So they started with just the most basic version of the idea just to test the waters.
Exactly. And that was all they needed to validate their core assumption. People are interested in group discounts.
Mm-hmm.
And from that really humble beginning, they built a billion-dollar business.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It really emphasizes that sometimes
Yeah.
the simplest approach is the most effective.
Ries also talks about this idea of a concierge MVP.
Okay.
This is where you essentially provide a personalized service to a small group of customers to really test your assumptions.
So it's like a behind-the-scenes manual version.
Exactly.
What the product or service will eventually
Yeah. It's about getting that detailed feedback
be.
and understanding customer needs at a really granular level,
Okay.
even if it means doing things manually at first.
And Ries uses the example of Aardvark,
Mm-hmm.
the question and answer service.
Yeah. They started with this really complex vision, right? They wanted this virtual assistant
Mm-hmm.
that could answer any question you could possibly have, but then they realized, wow, this is going to be incredibly difficult to build.
Yeah.
So what they did is they started by manually routing these questions to human experts.
Okay.
So they were essentially simulating the functionality of the product without building that complex technology.
So they were able to test their idea
Mm-hmm.
without getting bogged down in all the technical details up front.
Exactly. And this allowed them to validate their assumptions, refine their product, and ultimately build a successful business that was acquired by Google.
So I think these examples really drive home the point that
Yeah.
testing your assumptions early on is crucial.
Yeah.
But I imagine building an MVP can be kind of tricky.
It can be.
How do you balance quality and speed?
And Ries addresses this head on. He acknowledges that the idea of launching with something that isn't perfect can be really uncomfortable for a lot of entrepreneurs who take pride in their work.
It definitely goes against the grain of creating this polished product and then releasing it to the world.
But he argues that low quality in this context doesn't mean shoddy or buggy. It's about prioritizing those features that are really essential for testing your core assumptions, even if that means you have to sacrifice some polish in the first version.
And he uses the example of IMVU's early avatars.
Right.
They were just stationary at first because they hadn't developed the technology.
They hadn't quite figured out how to
get them to walk.
How do they work around that?
So they added a simple teleportation feature. Users could just click
Okay.
where they wanted their avatar to go.
Clever.
It wasn't pretty,
Right.
but it allowed them to test this core value proposition of moving avatars around
Right.
without investing in this complex walking technology. So they found this creative workaround to test the assumption.
And the feedback from that was super valuable.
Okay.
It confirmed that users really wanted to be able to move their avatars around,
Okay.
which helped them prioritize future development.
So it's a reminder that the MVP isn't about
getting that validated learning.
building this perfect product. It's about creating that validated learning as quickly as possible.
Exactly.
But I imagine there are some concerns about building an MVP.
There are?
Like, what are some of the fears that entrepreneurs might have?
Some people might be worried about legal stuff like patent infringement or exposing their ideas to competitors.
I mean, those are legitimate concerns.
Right.
But Ries offers some interesting counterpoints.
Yeah, he points out that patents are actually often used defensively, not offensively in a lot of industries.
Okay.
And when it comes to competitors stealing ideas, he actually encourages entrepreneurs to try to get their ideas stolen by established companies.
Why would you want someone to steal your idea?
He has this really interesting argument, he says, that most established companies are actually drowning in ideas. Their struggle is execution, not generating new ideas.
So the real danger isn't getting your idea stolen. It's not getting your product out there and testing the assumptions behind it.
Exactly.
But I think maybe the biggest fear entrepreneurs have is getting negative feedback on their MVP.
Nobody wants to hear that.
I mean, it's tough to pour your heart and soul into something and then have people criticize it.
But Ries has this really great point. He says that negative feedback is actually a gift. It provides valuable learning. He wants entrepreneurs to embrace this mindset of iteration, knowing that that first version probably isn't going to be perfect.
So you view the MVP as a stepping stone.
Exactly.
Not the final destination.
It's all about using that feedback that you get to iterate and refine and ultimately build something that customers love.
Okay, so you've built your MVP, you're collecting all this data. The next step is to actually measure your progress.
Right.
But as we've discussed, traditional accounting really isn't designed for the fast-paced, uncertain world of startups.
And that's where Ries introduces this idea of innovation accounting.
Okay, so can you break that down for me? What does that involve?
It's about moving away from traditional financial metrics and focusing on actionable metrics that directly measure customer behavior and learning.
So instead of focusing on revenue or profit, You're focusing on whether you're building something that's actually sustainable.
Exactly. And he uses this example of a really successful software startup that
Yeah.
he met with. They were growing rapidly,
Mm-hmm.
but when he asked, how do you know if you're actually improving the product,
Yeah.
their answers were kind of vague and based on gut feeling, not on data.
So they were relying more on intuition than hard evidence.
They were making decisions based on these vanity metrics like website hits
Right.
or new user signups instead of looking
Mhm.
at actionable metrics like engagement and retention.
Right. And that's a trap I think that a lot of startups fall into.
Absolutely.
Focusing on the numbers that look good, but
Yeah.
but don't actually
Don't tell the whole story.
tell the whole story.
Ries argues that this innovation accounting is really crucial
Mhm.
for making smart decisions about whether to pivot
Right.
or stick with your current strategy.
So it's about having a data-driven understanding
Exactly.
of whether what you're doing is actually moving the needle.
And one of the most important tools within this idea of innovation accounting
Yep.
is this concept of a learning milestone.
Okay, what's a learning milestone?
It's a really specific, measurable goal
Okay.
that helps you figure out whether you're actually making progress
Mm.
in validating your assumptions. So
Yeah.
that very first MVP that
Right.
you build can be a learning milestone.
Okay, so it's about setting goals for what you want to learn from each iteration
That's
of your
it.
product.
And then by tracking your progress against those milestones,
Mm-hmm.
you can make better decisions about whether to pivot or stay the course.
It's like treating your startup as a series of experiments,
Exactly.
each one designed to test a specific hypothesis
Yeah.
and gain some validated learning.
So as you work through these learning milestones,
Okay.
you're going to hit this really crucial decision point.
Mm-hmm.
Should you pivot or persevere with your current strategy?
That's got to be one of the hardest decisions for
It
an
is.
entrepreneur to make.
Absolutely. And Ries provides this framework for making that call.
Okay.
It boils down to whether you're seeing progress toward actually validating your core assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not, it might be time to pivot.
And pivoting doesn't mean scrapping the whole vision.
No,
No,
it might
it's not.
involve changing your target customer,
Okay.
your product features,
Mm-hmm.
even your business model.
So it's about finding a path
Right.
that actually leads to a sustainable business,
Exactly.
even if that means changing your course.
He uses the example of Votizen,
Okay.
which was a startup focused on civic engagement.
Mm-hmm.
They started with this idea of a social network for verified voters.
Okay. Sounds promising.
Did it work?
They built an MVP. They started gathering data.
Mm.
They were looking at registration rates, activation rates, retention rates, referral rates.
So they were taking a data-driven approach.
Yeah, but the data revealed something interesting.
Okay.
While they were having some success, it just wasn't enough.
Uh-oh.
The retention rates and referral rates were too low to make a sustainable business.
So they hit a wall.
They had to make this tough decision.
Right.
Pivot or persevere.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, they decided to pivot. They moved away from the social network idea
Okay.
and focused instead on a service that helped activists connect with verified voters
So they adapted their strategy,
Yes.
but they didn't abandon their core mission.
of increasing civic engagement.
And the pivot was the right call.
It was?
Their retention rates
But-
and referral rates were much higher with this new
Well,
model.
so it shows how powerful it can be
Yeah.
to use data to make decisions
Mm-hmm.
and to adapt to what the market is telling you.
Right. And it's a great reminder that pivoting isn't failing.
Mm-hmm.
It's about learning and finding a better path
Right.
to success.
Okay, so Ries also talks about
He does.
the different engines of growth
Right.
and how understanding those
Mm-hmm.
is really crucial for building sustainable growth.
And he identifies three main engines.
Okay, remind me what those are.
You've got the sticky engine, the viral engine,
Okay.
and the paid engine.
Okay, and I think we touched on those briefly, but how do those actually work in the real world?
So let's start with the sticky engine. The
Okay.
sticky engine is all about building a product or service that customers love
Mm-hmm.
and just keep coming back to.
So building loyalty, keeping that churn rate low.
Exactly. Key metrics here are going to be things like customer retention rate
Mhm.
and customer lifetime value.
So I imagine companies that are good at this often have features that encourage repeated use
Exactly.
and just keep people engaged.
Like think about products like Netflix or Spotify.
Yeah.
They're constantly adding value.
Right.
And they're using personalized recommendations,
Mm-hmm.
curated content, even social features to keep users coming back for more.
Okay, so what about the viral engine?
So the viral engine is about Leveraging word of mouth
Okay.
and social sharing to get new customers.
So it's like setting off this chain reaction, the
Exactly.
customer referrals.
The key metric here is going to be your viral coefficient,
Right.
which measures how many new customers each existing customer brings in.
Okay. And products that are inherently social or offer incentives for sharing often do well.
Yeah, think of things like Dropbox or Airbnb.
Okay.
They have these referral programs, they have social integrations and features
Yeah.
that just encourage users to invite their friends.
Okay. And when that viral coefficient is higher than 1.
You can see crazy growth. It's true.
Okay, so what about the paid engine?
So the paid engine is going to be your more traditional approach.
Right.
This is where you're using advertising and
Right.
other paid marketing to get new customers.
So it seems like this is often used by companies with a high customer lifetime value
Yeah,
because that allows them to justify the upfront cost of acquiring those customers.
exactly. Key metrics here are going to be cost per acquisition or CPA
Hmm.
and customer lifetime value.
So it's all about balancing
Or that balance.
the cost of getting a customer
hmm
with the revenue they'll bring in over time.
And companies that are really good at this usually have really strong marketing teams
Right.
and really sophisticated analytics.
Yeah, because they can really target the right customers and track that ROI.
Exactly. And Ries is clear that while startups can kind of dabble
Mm-hmm.
with these different growth engines,
Right.
they should really focus on mastering one at a time.
So pick the engine that makes the most sense
Exact, yeah.
for your product, for your market,
Mhm.
and just really focus on that one.
And that allows them to develop that expertise,
Yeah.
those systems to really make that engine hum.
And Ries uses Hotmail as this classic example of the viral engine in action.
Hotmail, which is one of the first
Mm-hmm.
web-based email services, saw this incredible growth in the late 1990s.
Right.
And a big part of that was this brilliant viral marketing campaign.
Okay.
They simply included this tagline
Right.
in every outgoing email. Get your private, free email at http://www.hotmail.com.
So their users were doing the marketing for them.
Exactly, that simple tactic
Wow.
combined with the inherent virality of email brought in millions of new users.
Wow, that's a brilliant example of how a simple idea can have a huge impact when you leverage the right growth engine.
Mm-hmm. Ries also talks about understanding these different customer currencies.
All about customer currencies.
Mhm.
What are those and why do they matter?
So customer currencies are essentially the resources
Okay.
that customers are willing to trade for your product or service.
Okay.
Time, money, skill, even passion.
So different customers might be motivated by different things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So early adopters,
Right.
for instance, might be willing to invest their time and effort
Mm-hmm.
in figuring out this new product.
Right.
Whereas mainstream customers might be more drawn to convenience and ease of use.
So understanding those differences can help you tailor your message
Yeah,
and even your product
exactly.
to the right audience.
Ries provides a framework for thinking about these customer currencies in terms of the technology adoption lifecycle.
Mm.
So you've got those early innovators, early adopters, early majority,
Right.
and beyond.
So your approach might need to change
It will.
as your product moves from those early adopters to a wider market.
And one of the biggest hurdles that startups face
Right.
is crossing the chasm between early adopters and the early majority.
So that's going from that niche market to the mainstream.
Yeah. And Ries believes that this requires this really important shift in focus. He says you got to move from product innovation
Okay.
to customer development.
So understanding the needs of that early majority
Exactly.
and really tailoring your product and your marketing
Mm-hmm.
to appeal to them.
Exactly. So once a startup finds that product market fit
Okay.
and they start growing,
Mm-hmm.
the next challenge is how do you build an adaptive organization that can keep innovating
Yeah.
and scaling effectively?
And that's where Ries introduces the innovation sandbox.
Exactly. The Innovation Sandbox is all about creating this protected space within a larger organization
Yeah.
where teams can experiment
Right.
without getting bogged down in all the traditional processes and bureaucracy.
So it's like building a mini startup
It is.
inside of the company.
Exactly. And Ries highlights the importance of structuring these innovation teams the right way.
Okay, so what are some of the things that make those teams?
They need resources, but not too many.
Okay.
Enough to make progress, but not so much that they become complacent.
So they got to feel a little bit of
Yeah.
pressure to deliver.
They need the authority to make decisions,
Right.
to experiment without needing to run everything up the flagpole.
So give them the power to move fast, and be iterative.
Exactly. And having that personal stake in the outcome is huge.
Right. It's not someone else's idea. It's
Mm-hmm.
something they really want to see succeed.
Exactly. That passion and ownership are critical
Yeah.
for driving innovation.
Ries also emphasizes that these innovation teams
Mm-hmm.
need some clear guidelines.
They do. It's about creating a framework that protects both the main organization and the innovation team. Right. You want to make sure that all this experimentation doesn't end up disrupting the core business.
He uses the example of a company
Right.
that was afraid to innovate because they were worried about
Yeah.
cannibalizing their existing revenue streams.
The classic innovator's dilemma.
And so Ries suggests they use this sandbox approach.
Start small with these experiments that are separate from
Right.
the main business.
Like dipping your toes in the water
Exactly.
before you jump all the way in.
Exactly. And then by starting small and collecting data, they can build that confidence and eventually integrate those successful innovations
Right.
back into the larger organization.
So Ries then gets into this idea of managing the management portfolio, where he says companies need to learn to juggle all these different types of work.
He identifies 4 main types.
Okay.
You've got running the existing business, pursuing incremental improvements,
Okay.
exploring adjacent innovations, and pursuing these disruptive innovations.
It's like having a diversified portfolio
It is.
of initiatives, each with its own
Exactly.
level of risk and potential.
And the key is figuring out how to allocate your resources, your talent, to these different types of work based on how strategically important they are
Okay.
and how much uncertainty is involved.
So it's about balancing optimizing for today with investing in tomorrow.
Right. And this often requires a shift in mindset for managers
Right.
who are often trained to prioritize operational excellence.
Efficiency. But in today's world, companies need to be efficient,
Yeah,
but they also need to be adaptable
exactly.
to change.
Managing the management portfolio is all about creating that structure and the culture that supports both.
Ries also provides some advice on how to nurture those disruptive innovations within a company.
Yeah, he emphasizes that disruptive innovations often start by targeting underserved customers or creating entirely new markets.
So it's those opportunities that maybe bigger companies would overlook
They would.
because they're so focused on serving their existing customers.
Exactly. And he even suggests that established companies should create separate divisions or subsidiaries to pursue these innovations, to give them the freedom and independence.
So it's recognizing that a disruptive innovation might need a different
They will need a different approach.
a different culture
Exactly.
than the core business.
And Ries also stresses the importance of integrating those successful innovations back into the parent organization,
Right. Yeah.
but doing it in a way that doesn't stifle their growth.
That's tough
It is.
because you want to leverage the resources of the bigger company, but you also want to keep that
Right.
agility.
That entrepreneurial spirit that made the innovation work in the first place.
Now, Ries is honest about the fact that implementing lean startup principles within a big company can be challenging.
Oh, yeah.
It often means changing how people think,
It does.
challenging long-held beliefs about how work should be done.
Absolutely.
And that's got to be really hard for managers who have built their careers on traditional ways.
Especially middle management. They're the ones that are often most resistant to this.
Yeah. Ries shares his own experience with this, talking about the resistance he faced when he was trying to implement these ideas at IMVU.
Yeah, he met with a lot of skepticism and pushback from people who were used to doing things a certain way.
Yeah.
He had to constantly advocate for these ideas and prove their value through results.
It's a reminder that change is never easy,
It's not.
especially when it challenges the status quo.
But Ries believes that the benefits of embracing the lean startup ultimately outweigh the difficulties.
It's about creating this more adaptive, more innovative, and ultimately more successful organization.
Exactly. And Ries ends the book with this really powerful message.
Okay.
He says the lean startup movement isn't just about building better businesses. It's about building a better world.
That's a bold statement.
It is.
How does he tie the lean startup to these bigger?
He argues that in the 21st century, our biggest challenge isn't how to build things. It's what to build.
I mean, we have the technology, we have the resources.
We do.
We can build pretty much anything.
Exactly. And Ries believes that the lean startup can help us focus our creative energy
Okay.
on solving the world's most critical problems.
So using these principles to
Mhm.
address things in healthcare or education or even government.
Yeah, he wants to redefine what productivity means,
Okay.
moving away from this focus on individual efficiency
Mm-hmm.
and toward the effectiveness of the whole system.
So it's not just about how much we produce.
It's about how much we learn.
It's about what impact we create.
Exactly. And Ries believes that the lean startup movement can help us build this more sustainable, more equitable, and ultimately more fulfilling future.
That's an amazing vision.
Yeah.
But Ries doesn't just leave us with this lofty ideal.
No, he doesn't.
He actually offers some really concrete suggestions
Yes.
for making it happen.
He does.
What are some of those?
So one of them is setting up startup testing labs
Okay.
where researchers can actually study how effective different product development methods are and really try to figure out the best practices for building successful startups.
So it's like applying the scientific method
It is.
to starting a business.
Exactly. And he believes that these labs could be really instrumental in helping us understand how to build successful businesses in
Yeah.
the 21st century.
Okay, so that's one suggestion.
Yeah.
But he also proposes something a little bit more radical,
He does.
the creation of a long-term stock exchange.
Mm.
So tell me more about that. What is a long-term stock exchange and why does he think it's so important?
So a long-term stock exchange would be a marketplace
Okay.
where companies are actually valued
Mm-hmm.
based on their long-term sustainability
Okay.
and their ability to create a positive social impact, not just short-term profits.
So it's changing the incentives for businesses
Yeah.
so that they're not just focused on
And it's
maximizing returns for their shareholders.
It's about focusing on creating long-term value
Right.
for everyone, not just short-term profit.
It's a bold idea.
It is.
But I think it gets to the heart of a problem
It
that we
does.
have with our current economic system.
Because our current system often encourages this short-term thinking, this obsession with quarterly profits,
Right.
and that can discourage investment in things like innovation and sustainability.
So Ries thinks that a long-term stock exchange
It could help rebalance.
could help create a
Yeah.
more ethical and sustainable form of capitalism.
Exactly. He acknowledges that implementing such a system would be really challenging.
Yeah, it would require a change in mindset.
It would.
I imagine for a lot of people, investors, regulators,
Yeah,
business leaders.
absolutely.
But he believes that the potential benefits are huge.
They are.
It could lead to this more equitable, more sustainable, and ultimately more prosperous economy
For everyone.
for everyone.
Now, Ries also reflects on this historical context of the lean startup movement.
Oh.
And he makes this really interesting comparison to the scientific management movement
Okay.
of the early 20th century.
Scientific management, led by Frederick Winslow Taylor, was this huge movement
It was.
that really changed how we think about work.
Yeah.
How does that relate to the lean startup?
Ries sees these really interesting similarities between the two movements.
Okay.
Both were driven by this idea of applying scientific principles to improve efficiency
Right.
and productivity.
And I imagine both movements faced a lot of resistance from people who were used to doing things the old way.
Absolutely. But Ries is also aware of the flaws of scientific management,
Okay.
particularly this tendency to make work feel really impersonal
Yeah.
and treat workers like cogs in a machine.
And I think Taylor's approach often did lead to more efficiency,
It did.
but sometimes at the expense of
Right.
employee morale and job satisfaction.
And Ries stresses that the lean startup movement needs to avoid those mistakes.
Okay.
It needs to take this more human-centered approach,
Right.
where people are valued for their creativity, their problem-solving skills, their ability to learn and adapt.
So it's not just about the numbers.
It's not.
It's about the people.
It's about the people who are doing the work. And Ries also suggests this new research program focused on studying how to actually be productive in
Right.
situations where there's a lot of uncertainty.
Interesting, because we don't really know
We don't.
what works in those situations.
So he's calling for a more scientific way of studying entrepreneurship.
So what does he propose?
He suggests setting up these startup testing labs
Okay.
where researchers can experiment with
Okay.
different product development methods, collect data, and really figure out what are the best practices for building these successful startups.
It's like taking the scientific method and applying it to the art of starting a business.
And Ries thinks these labs could be real game changers
Mm-hmm.
in helping us figure out how to build those successful businesses in the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, it's an exciting idea. It could lead
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
new discoveries, new tools that could help entrepreneurs everywhere.
And then Ries throws out this other really radical idea.
Right.
He says, what about creating a long-term stock exchange?
Long-term stock exchange? I've never heard of that. What would that look like, and why does he think it's important?
So a long-term stock exchange would be a marketplace where companies aren't judged solely on their short-term profits.
Okay.
They're valued based on their long-term sustainability and their ability to have this positive social impact.
So it's really changing the incentives for businesses
Exactly.
so that they're not just focused on making their shareholders happy right now, but they're thinking about
Right. It's about creating that long-term value for everyone,
the long term.
not just those short-term profits.
It's a bold idea,
It is.
but I think it gets to the heart of a problem with our current economic system.
Our current system often encourages this short-term thinking and this obsession with quarterly profits.
Right. And that can discourage investment in things like innovation
Exactly.
and sustainability.
Which are essential for a healthy economy.
And so Ries thinks that this long-term stock exchange could help fix that.
It could help rebalance things.
Yeah, it could create a more ethical, more sustainable form of capitalism.
Exactly. And he acknowledges that implementing such a system would be challenging.
I imagine so.
It would require a shift in mindset from investors, regulators, business leaders.
But he believes the potential benefits are huge,
They are.
leading to this more equitable, more sustainable, and ultimately more prosperous economy for everyone.
And Ries also reflects on this historical context of the lean startup movement, and he makes this comparison to the scientific management movement of the early 20th century.
Scientific management, led by Frederick Winslow Taylor, was this huge movement that really changed how we think about work.
It revolutionized the way
right.
we think about work.
So how does that relate to the lean startup?
Ries sees these really interesting similarities between the two movements.
Okay.
Both were really driven by this desire
to apply scientific principles to make work more efficient and more productive.
And I imagine both movements faced a lot of resistance.
Absolutely.
For people who are used to doing things the old way.
But Ries is also aware of the flaws of scientific management.
Okay, what are those?
Particularly this tendency to make work feel really impersonal.
Right.
And to treat workers like cogs in a machine.
And I think Taylor's approach often did result in greater efficiency.
It did.
But it sometimes came at the cost of employee morale and job satisfaction.
And Ries stresses that the lean startup movement needs to avoid those mistakes.
He's not just about
It's about taking this more human-centered approach.
the numbers. It's about the people who are doing the work.
Where people are valued for their creativity, for their
Right.
problem-solving abilities, for their ability to learn and adapt. It's about building a work environment where everyone feels empowered to use their talents and make a real difference. That's a great point. And Ries highlights that the lean startup isn't just about applying these abstract principles, it's about putting them into practice. And one of the most valuable tools he recommends is the 5 whys analysis, which he borrowed from the world of lean manufacturing.
The 5 whys is this deceptively simple but incredibly powerful technique for getting to the root of a problem. You repeatedly ask why until you've uncovered all the contributing factors that are leading to the issue.
So you keep digging deeper, peeling back the layers of the problem until you get to that core cause.
Exactly. And Ries emphasizes that this isn't about placing blame or pointing fingers. It's about understanding the system as a whole and finding areas where you can make improvements.
He uses a great example from his time at IMVU. They were getting customer complaints about a new product they had launched.
At first, it seemed like a technical issue, but when they used the 5 whys, they found out that the real root cause was a lack of adequate training for their new engineers.
So what appeared to be a technical problem on the surface was actually a management problem at its core.
You got it. And by getting to the real root cause, they were able to fix the problem effectively and prevent it from happening again.
It's a perfect example of how the 5 whys can be used to understand all sorts of problems, from technical glitches to customer service issues, even to figuring out why your overall strategy isn't working.
Exactly. And Ries suggests that when teams discover the root cause of a problem during the 5 whys process, they should invest in solutions at that same level.
What does that mean exactly?
It means matching your effort to the severity of the problem and where it originates. If it's a minor issue, maybe just a quick fix will do. But if you uncover a recurring problem, or if you find that the issue is rooted in a deeper, more systemic problem, you might need to invest more time and energy into making fundamental changes. Maybe you need to overhaul a process or implement better training.
So it's about understanding the problem and then choosing the right level of intervention to address the root cause.
Right. And Ries offers some great tips for implementing the five whys analysis within any organization. For example, he recommends appointing a five whys master. This person facilitates the meetings and makes sure everyone follows through on implementing the solutions that the team comes up with.
So you have someone who's accountable for making sure that the process works the way it's supposed to.
Precisely. He also emphasizes the importance of including everyone who is connected to the problem in the Five Whys session, even if that means you have to bring in senior leaders or people from other departments. You want to have everyone who has a stake in the problem in the room so you can make sure you're seeing the whole picture.
And make sure everyone who's new to the process gets a clear explanation of how the five whys works.
Exactly. You want to set clear expectations and make sure everyone understands how valuable this process can be. And by regularly using the five whys, companies can build a culture of continuous improvement and learning. It's about creating a system where problems are seen as opportunities to learn and grow, not just setbacks.
Ries shares the example of IGN Entertainment, the media company, to show how the five whys can be used to address real-world challenges.
They had a pretty big problem when their content management system crashed, preventing users from posting or editing their blog entries.
That's a major problem for a media company. They need to keep their content fresh.
Absolutely. And while they could have just put a band-aid on the technical problem and moved on, they decided to use the five whys to get to the root cause.
So they use that issue as an opportunity to learn and make improvements.
Exactly. And as they worked through the five whys, they discovered several contributing factors. Their software had some incompatible components, they weren't testing thoroughly in their production environment, and they had a culture that allowed for making changes late on Friday nights, which is always a recipe for trouble.
So it wasn't just a single technical issue. It was a combination of technical and cultural factors that contributed to the problem.
Precisely. And by understanding all the underlying causes, they were able to implement a combination of solutions. They improved how they deployed changes, they started doing more rigorous testing, and they even shifted their company culture away from those last-minute risky changes.
It's a great example of how using the five whys can lead to systemic changes that go beyond just addressing the immediate symptoms of a problem.
And Reese's point is that this approach isn't about just fixing things in the moment. It's about creating a culture where everyone is thinking in terms of continuous improvement, where mistakes are seen as opportunities for learning and growth. It's about building a more adaptive organization.
And I think that's one of the key takeaways from the lean startup. It's not just about applying a set of tools or techniques. It's a whole philosophy that can be applied to all sorts of challenges, whether you're building a business, working on a project, or even just navigating the ups and downs of life.
I agree. It's about embracing experimentation, committing to continuous learning, and always being ready to adapt as the world changes around us.
Well, there you have it. Our deep dive into The Lean Startup by Ries. It's a book that's chock full of insights and advice that anyone can use. It's practical, it's inspiring, and it might just change how you think about approaching challenges.
Definitely worth a read.
As you explore these ideas, think about this. What's one assumption you've been holding on to in your own work or in your life that you can test using the principles we've discussed today? Maybe it's time to try a little experiment and see what you learn. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.